I think we will see a new economics emerging on this sort of human machine intelligence combinations, particularly when there's high stakes, like with driverless cars, surgery, and so on. It's not simply a movement from human intelligence to machine intelligence, as many expected, perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. Often you need new combinations of them to cope with the stakes involved in error. It struck me, Adam Smith's brilliant description of the pin factory in the division of labor, which opened up a whole host of economic insight into how real economies work, perhaps needs complementing with some of the things Nick was talking about there, which is understanding divisions of cultures. Now, this has been written about a lot in anthropology and sociology, but almost not at all in economics, that a sophisticated, well-functioning economy doesn't just require a division of labor and multiple skills, but actually different moral syndromes, different moral perspectives. Your auditors should have a different moral view of the world than your inventors or your entrepreneurs or your design team. This is in some ways how human societies and how complexity works. And if they become too blurred and your accountants become too creative, or your designers become too backward looking, too fixated on memory, your economy is inefficient. If your government becomes too involved in enterprise, that will itself lead to all sorts of corruptions and errors, just as if businesses become too much like governments, that creates all sorts of pathologies. So I would love to see some analysis of the appropriate divisions of culture in a modern economy, which is an aspect of cognition which goes beyond the purely sort of rational, but is very much something Adam Smith would have recognized in his analysis of the moral sentiments, the role of sympathy and so on in different roles. And I think we've lost a lot of the subtlety of his work in that respect.
What we think about this relationship between minds and markets. Do we think that markets are similar to minds? So there's some things that we can learn from minds and apply them to markets. There's some things we can learn about markets and apply them to minds. So is this kind of analogy? Or do we actually think that they're both just different ways of instantiating the same underlying thing? Maybe that's intelligence, for example.
So I'm not a brain scientist, but my understanding is that not many neuroscientists now would ascribe to the 30, 40-year-old model of the mind as computer. And indeed, most of the work of the last 10 or 15 years has been reimagining the mind as much more like a market, which is to say, our brains are made up of multiple modules, elements, sometimes cooperating, often competing, voting on decisions in ways which are very different from a classic hierarchical, central processing unit. And indeed, if you take that idea seriously, then the sort of multi-level framework I've described, I think makes much more sense. It's not as if there is a coherent individual who is the primary unit of analysis and of thought, who may be aggregated up into markets or other things. Instead, we have a much more messy, complex, multi-level processes of thought going down right to the synaptic level, which through different processes of, as I say, aggregation, voting, competition, reach decisions in your own brain, whether you buy this thing or that thing, whether you make this call or that call. But very comparable processes are happening within the group, within the organization, within the market, within the whole society. So if that is correct, then they look rather similar, the mind and the market.
Do you think markets are like minds, or do you think that markets are minds? Do you think they're the same thing?
Well, I suspect this is going to be our fundamental issue of disagreement, or at least differences of perspectives. We are so used to the idea of cognition happening within our heads, and literally within our heads and only within our heads. It's very difficult, I think, to get one's head around the idea of the extended mind hypothesis, the idea that so much of our thought actually depends on physical objects or other people or plants or animals, all sorts of other things, as well as computers. And clearly there is, to my mind at least, there is cognition happening at multiple levels, but the cognition which happens in, let's say, my university or my university department is different from what is happening inside my mind, just as what's happening inside my mind is probably different from what's happening inside one of the modules of my mind. So they are similar, but not identical. And the scientific challenge is, I think, to become more precise in clarifying the nature of cognition at multiple scales, all the way up to the global scale in a pandemic or in relation to, let's say, climate change and the IPCC, and getting greater clarity of what happens when they are in conflict with each other, when the evolutionary logic and rewards at the individual level clash with the interests of the community or the society, and maybe what's in the interests of Scotland or the UK clashes with the interests of Europe and the world. And these happen all the time, and they're kind of obvious when you think about it, but our theories of multi-level evolution are still quite weak, I think.
The question I have is for Andrew. Last month, the new Library of Mistakes was opened, and the keynote was by Lord Alistair Darling, who was the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer during the global financial crisis. Part of the context of this symposium are the lessons from the systemic crisis, which had sometimes an existential nature. In 2019, early 2020, we had the repo crisis. And I think it would be also, because Geoff mentioned the financial crash, it would be very important to hear from you how dangerous this situation was, particularly because it was under the radar, a bit stealthy, less well known than the global financial crisis. That's my question. Thanks.
Thanks. As chair of this session, I think I've probably been fairly invisible myself, so I kind of thanks for bailing me out, Patrick. I mean, my job is to run our markets function at the Bank of England, and I think we sort of rely on markets for three things. We need to know what they're telling us in order to set policy. We transact in them a great deal, either on behalf of the government or to enact the policies. And we also, from time to time, have to step in when they're not working and try and fix them. And you know, actually listening to the discussion this morning, there's a huge number of analogies. It probably takes a bit of effort to drag them out of the discussion, but a huge number of analogies there for the kind of tasks that we have. I mean, you mentioned the developments of the last couple of years. I mean, one could go back, you know, several years since 2008. 2008 was the biggest single earthquake in markets of recent times, because the problems that we were dealing with came out of markets themselves. They were not triggered by some independent event. More recently, as you say, there have been a whole series of developments which have challenged us again. In 2019, the Federal Reserve was trying to exit quantitative easing. That didn't go so well. They had to reverse that in the end. When they began doing that, they had assumed that the banking system would deal with that unwind in a relatively smooth way. Much earlier than they had predicted, the banking system decided to get uncomfortable about the reduction in reserves, and interest rates began rising sharply, and they had to reverse their policy. That was not a crisis on the scale of 2008. It was an unexpected development and something that they had to quickly correct. Much more serious was what happened in 2020 when the lockdowns began globally as a result of COVID, caused by the COVID crunch, not by the financial system, but it triggered something which was colloquially called the dash for cash, which caused almost many large wholesale actors in the economy to want to get liquid quickly. There was a fear that there may be, you know, God knows what was going to happen, as all of us remember. And the system shuddered, and it shuddered very badly. And central banks had to step in and meet that demand for liquidity in massive size. There's an active debate going on now about whether that response was partly, you know, a cause of the inflation that we're seeing now, whether that was triggered by other things. The complexity of the markets that we now face off to, the relative thinness of the infrastructure that sits in the middle of it to deal with these massive flows, the speed The algorithmic systems that many players in the market now use make this organism that we face off to a full-time business to understand and to enact in. And I don't think anyone actually involved in it thinks of it as a particularly simple system at all. It's interesting, Nick says, oh, we don't talk about the market as having feelings and so forth. Actually, if you read economic commentary, sort of city scribblers, people talk about markets in that anthropomorphic way all the time. The market is feeling pretty uneasy today. The market had a bad week. The market is on a bit of a downer. This type of language, and I'm not sure whether it's a terribly deep point, is actually used all of the time. I spent all of my time telling people, sorry to those who subscribe to this, that it is not one single organism, but a whole series of different and deliberately competing views. And actually, that's what markets are for. If there was only one view, if there was only one mind, the market literally would not exist.
What I'm going to do is present a Bayesian mechanics that may or may not be useful for agent-based simulations in the context of minds in markets. So that's my agenda. So it's quite a low-level, very pragmatic agenda. And I'm going to take self-evidencing as sort of a normative principle that underwrites the way that you might try and simulate sentient agents, sentient behavior in a multi-agent or an ensemble setting. So I'm going to motivate this from the perspective of normative models of sentient behavior. I'm going to take a first principle account. So this is part of my light entertainment. So I'm going to deny access to all axioms, and I'm going to ask from the perspective of a physicist, what kinds of behaviors will any self-organizing system have to possess and should be evinced in the way that we observe it behaving. And I'm going to basically promote a principle of least action as a way to ground simulations, and then give you a few examples of what we call active inference in terms of the ensuing belief propagation, with a special emphasis on epistemic foraging. So I was very pleased to hear about epistemic markets. That's really going to be quite center stage in terms of the story that could be developed using this kind of Bayesian mechanics, with a special emphasis on shared narratives, and by that I'm sort of reading that as our version of this distributed cognition and belief updating. We can then apply this kind of technology with this particular focus on this epistemic imperative to resolve uncertainty, this sort of optimal Bayesian design kind of notion, given that we are all faced with this problem all the time, you know, in terms of deciding what to invest in if you're in finance, through to simply where to look next. The notion here is that sort of the way that we move and query, interrogate the world is literally an experiment, and therefore is subject to the principles of optimal Bayesian experimental design. You can write this down, you can simulate it, and produce remarkably lifelike behavior. Taking that mechanics into the context, which I think you'll be much more interested in, of distributed cognition and belief sharing and mutual inference. First of all, stepping from sort of, you know, me making sense of my universe to me making sense of you and looking at dyadic interactions, brings us to sort of notions of knowing my place, having a shared generative model, which means that we can both have a shared commitment to the way the world works, and to minimize our surprise, to resolve our uncertainty. I just have to find my place in our shared world, and then we provide each other with the right signals, and everything becomes mutually predictable.
The elephant in the room is the economy is about the physicality of production, the market's about the psychology of their exchange. These are quotes. Let me go quickly here. The elephant in economics room is the mind-body problem. Right? So let me talk about the mind-body problem. I won't. In simple terms, the mind-body problem asks to explain the relationship between matter, the brain, and mind. Okay, how about that, guys? As a problem, we heard today that the levels problem and the measurement problem are future problems. It's in the coordination that you actually see this emergence happen. This relation, I mean, that relational view is coming in strongly Actually, I think the Vice Provost mentioned quantum entanglement. Things are connected here, you know, and they're remotely connected. So you hit it here, you get a response over there. Circuits don't do that kind of thing. Synergies do it, but circuits don't very well. So it's a relational idea, and that relation is fundamentally the baby and the mobile, namely the organism and the environment.
If in economics and markets, the causes of data about economic events are mental in nature, as stated above, then in that case, the game becomes one of trying to optimize beliefs about mental causes. This suggests a new approach to predicting markets, not by modeling the market itself, which seems to at least get us nowhere, because prior market data are not good predictors of future market states, but by modeling the causal determinants of markets, that is, minds informed by market data. Thinking of the anticipation and prediction of discrete events in systems, like markets or minds, what kind of approach, Karl, does the free energy principle applied to markets suggest for the prediction of discrete events and state transitions in markets? And likewise for Scott under the rubric of dynamical systems.
I think, you see, why I showed you this example in the squid data, in the brain, dynamics, is that you can actually see anticipatory signatures of change. So if you had the market under the same constraints, if you knew the time scales, right? Time scales are crucial in these non-equilibrium phenomena, in these open systems, okay? So as parameters, whatever those parameters are changing, you'll only see these transitions if you give the system long enough to relax after a perturbation. So your control parameter is perturbing the system, and then the system's relaxing back. And as it approaches change, it's relaxing back slower and slower. That's called critical slowing down.
Practically speaking, I think you'd have to ask what you mean by consciousness. So, you know, the notion of mind in market. From the point of view of the free energy principle, there are different kinds of minds. There are very simple minds that do self-correction and have a homeostasis. And then there are more complicated kinds of minds, effectively generative models, that are able to model the consequences of their own action should they acquire agency. And these become deep generative models, and very simply, they move you from a thermostat to something that can plan. Mm-hmm. So I think the question you have to ask is, do markets plan? So are they mindful in the sense that they're restorative and they have some preferred states, even though they're itinerant in the way that they maintain those states, so they never actually get to those states? But right. Are markets mindful in the sense that I have a homeostasis and I'm self-correcting, like the weather or evolution? Mm-hmm. Or do you really mean that they can plan and they would show that intrinsic curiosity, they would actually be capable of deceit, they'd actually ask questions? Because that to my mind is a big question, and it's the kind of question I would ask of evolution.
As I was completely new to cognitive economics, I've really taken my understanding for what it is of cognitive economics from Patrick's paper, the 2022 paper, the primer that he circulated to us, and also the shorter version of it that appears in Economic Affairs. So to a certain extent, the first part of the paper is an engagement with the arguments that Patrick puts forward, rather than an engagement with the field of people working in the area of cognitive economics or the market mind hypothesis. Patrick posits the two-way premise of market as mind and mind as market. In this talk, I focus really on the market as mind component. I mean, maybe that's a problem in that if I understood better what the mind as market component was about, my comments on the market as mind components would be better informed, but this is the way it is. Now, as I understand it, the central claim of this component of the market mind hypothesis is that the market mind is a collective mind with market mood its phenomenal experience. And I hope that's an uncontentious summary of the core notion of the market mind hypothesis. Now, what I want to argue is that this central claim is presented in two quite different modes. One mode is that there is a mind, the market mind, or the market as mind, is the mind of a singular collective entity. This comes in various forms of manifestations, but it's quite clear that it's a singular collective entity. The second mode, I argue, is in terms of the intersubjective relations of market investors. Now, it strikes me that these two modes are very, very different. And I find the distinction very interesting, particularly the second mode. And what I would like to do is to present an interpretation of the second mode, the intersubjective relations, in terms of some of the work that I've been doing that I mentioned a few moments ago, for example, in relation to game theory. Now, this interpretation of the second mode leads me to question the standard individual-collective dichotomy, which I think is standard right across the disciplines, across philosophy, across all the social sciences, and I've been hearing it today. And I've come across it in some of the reading that I've done, and I certainly think it's very present in Patrick's paper as well. I then provide an example of how different economic implications might well follow from the intersubjective approach. And here I suppose I relate to the issue of, well, even if the market can be thought of as a mind, what difference would that make to how we analyse economic relations of the market? And what I do here is to offer a summary of the kind of approach I've taken in relation to game theory, where I argue that we get very, very different results if we analyse it in terms of intersubjective relations between players as opposed to individual relations between players. And in that particular case, I also argue that the intersubjective approach provides a very simple and intuitive explanation of some of the difficulties that game theory has encountered. These difficulties are well recognised in the literature, for example. So, say, for example, the equilibrium selection problem. Okay, and then at the end of that, I just pose the possibility of some implications for the market mind hypothesis. If we say that each of us chooses our best action, given the action that each of us chooses, that no longer makes sense. Because what you're no longer doing is separating the subject player from the other player or the other players. What we're doing now is that each of us chooses our best action given the action that each of us chooses. But we can't choose our best action given the action that each of us chooses, because if you like, that's to assume the outcome of the reasoning before you actually engage in the reasoning. So it's logically, it doesn't make sense. It's not just an issue of logic, it's a question of sort of ordinary language. Now the reason for this is that each player includes herself among us as a plurality, and this breaks with the strict individualism required for best reply reasoning. So the shared standpoint of each of us thus potentially transforms the logic of individual choice in game theory.
Now it seems as though most philosophers who like the idea of a group mind or group level mental states don't really like the idea of group consciousness. I'm not going to read that. I want to be able to speculate also. But sometimes they say something that sounds a lot like, we want mentality, group mentality, we don't want group level consciousness. But then some of the same people also sometimes say, well, groups can have states that are access conscious, so they can have consciousness in some sense, just not the phenomenal sense. So they can't feel pain, right? And they can't, enjoy the smell of roses or whatever, right? But they can have access consciousness. Awareness is another phrase sometimes used that comes from David Chalmers. But it refers to the same thing as what Ned Block calls access consciousness, or at least we can assume that that's so here?
It seems that we preserve the self-conception of a baby, and on the level of the baby that might be quite adequate. When we persist with the self-conception once we move into a larger world and become members of groups who are involved in complex interactions, and there the self-conception becomes increasingly more inadequate, because we can think of human societies as of complex systems where the interaction is not really in the hands of the individual. And the market mind hypothesis, I think, is, with all the questions that Vivienne and Søren have raised, reveals this dilemma. So on the one hand, we have a complex system which is dynamic and which develops dynamics beyond the control of the individual agents. But those who interfere in the market can hardly accept that. So we just heard someone who said, what are we going to do about that? As if they could do something about that individually. But it's, so psychologists tell us that if we lose the self-conception of agents who can actively interfere in the world and take control of things, we can't live anymore. It's traumatic, actually, to leave that self-conception behind.
That's one of the themes I want to develop this afternoon. That economic models are not about telling us true stories, giving us true accounts about how the world works. They're ways of conveying insight into how the world works, and we need many models and many approaches. If practical economist needs a toolkit of models and learns to apply particular models to particular problems. Mervyn King and I developed a detailed critique of this subjective expected utility book in our recent book, which Gerd was kind enough to mention this morning. And I'll only sketch out their basic arguments. But the key point is that rational individuals do not attach probabilities to every conceivable event, or even very many conceivable events, in a world in which information is necessarily imperfect and unequally distributed. It would be irrational to do anything else. The rational response to individuals asked to report such probabilities is, I don't know. And then, if it matters, I will try to find out. And only rarely will the answer be sensibly expressed as a probability or a probability distribution. We argue that uncertainty arises essentially from imperfect information.
So my question is really about governance, and rather than the technical problems with ESG, but really about whether or not the problems of governance are going to make the ESG transition even longer. So can we rely on individual investors or companies to pursue ESG transitions? And maybe shouldn't we perhaps be looking at a more directed economy to deal with a lot of the environmental problems that we're likely to face in the near future?
Well, I think you're aware of that. It's already one of the hottest summers we've ever seen. You look at India, the Southwest America is just a nightmare. So, you know, the climate issue is front and forward. And the question is, which is going to take precedence? And I fear, to my great regret, that there's going to be backsliding on ESG. The unknown is what happens if the Fed pivots and what causes them to pivot. They have to maintain this tightening policy here. And they have to do it until there is an accident, because they lost credibility because of the transitory. And if reality be faced, the central banks are the cause of all the financial crises since the Fed was invented. And they will continue to be until something is changed. So I think the odds of stagflation are very high. The real concern I have is food. And food is what causes social unrest. Now, if the Fed is committed to create wealth destruction in the US equity market, and by that inference, rolling over into the world, then the question is, will this demand destruction, wealth destruction, create demand destruction? And that's the $64,000 question. I, for one, don't think they're going to have the courage to ride this through very long, and that financial crisis that emerges will occur in the next 2-3 months, 4 months maybe.
And I suppose my question relating to models and to radical uncertainty is really just, why are we still using models which we all know do not work? How is it that these are perpetuated?
Right. It's an interesting question that raises a whole variety of issues, from the way in which, bizarrely, stock options were introduced under the illusion that this was a way of aligning managerial incentives with shareholder interests. In fact, they've become the primary cause of friction between managers and shareholders. Now, that then takes us into deeper questions about the nature and models of the firm. In terms of how you get your articles published in journals, well, I probably don't have to tell you the standard templates for publishing in an economic journal. You either create something called the model, which is preferably tweaking the assumptions on some established model, or you do some piece of work on a large data set. And that's what journals are looking for. And I'm afraid one could tell the same story about most other disciplines in universities at the moment. Peer review has many virtues, but it also has the vice of giving relatively little scope to things that are genuinely original. And the story, which is certainly common in economics, of the articles which were widely rejected before they were published and won Nobel Prizes for there are, in fact, I cited one in terms of Akerlof's Lemons article, which is one of the most influential articles over the last 50 years, but was, I understand, widely rejected before he finally succeeded in publishing it.
The distinction between risk and uncertainty, just to get the concepts clear. As we all know, the idea goes back to Frank Knight. And risk, I define it using Savage's terms. Risk is a situation where we know all possible future states in the world. There are consequences and probabilities. That is, that we know the exhaustive and mutually exclusive set of all the future states that can happen, and also the exhaustive and mutually exclusive set of all consequences. And if it's risk, there are probabilities. So for Savage, a small world is defined by the state space. If you have the probability, it's risk. If you don't have them, it's ambiguity. And that's the world of finance theory. That's the world of the Markowitz-Merton tradition. And that's the world of most of economic modeling. And if there is a problem, a real-world problem that's about uncertainty or interactability, it's reduced to a lottery. Uncertainty means not that only the probabilities are not known, as Knight is often interpreted, but the state space is not known. So we do not know everything can happen in the future. So here's the question, the following questions: how can a business predict which customers will buy again? So from based on a huge customer base and with lots of data, and that's so one, again, we have two visions. One is it's a complex problem, we need a complex solution. And here is a standard model for marketing. I'm not going to any details. You just look at it, be impressed, and yeah. It has lots of parameter, and that will be the problem. Now, the other vision is to study how experienced managers actually make the decision. And the answer is that one of the typical heuristic being used is the so-called hiatus heuristic. If a customer hasn't purchased in 9 months or some other hiatus, classifies inactive, otherwise as active. It's again a one good reason heuristic. All other information is ignored. I show you briefly a study by 2 professors of management who believed in the Pareto negative binomial model, but went out to show empirically which is actually better, as opposed to what's currently mainstream behavioral economists who know already what's better, and blame managers as having cognitive illusions or something like that. That's a non-empirical science. So that was the result. They tested the databases of 3 companies, an airline, an apparel, and CD Now, and they found that in the airline, the hiatus heuristic predicted 70% of the customer's behavior correct, the Pareto negative binomial distribution, 74. The same for the apparel, and in CD Now it was equal. You just saved all the computation and all the hassle. This is called a less is more effect. Then the question arises, which is the interesting question. After showing less is more effect, but like Andy Haldane's question, is can we understand when they happen, when they don't happen? And I'll show you a mathematical proof just in that's intuitive, that explains when a single Q, like in the heuristic that I showed you, can never be beaten by any linear model such as logistic regression. So the situation is called a dominant Q. And to illustrate, there are 5 Qs, and their weights are conditional to the weights of different, like beta weights. So the additional contribution. So if the additional contribution of the other Qs, their sum, doesn't exceed that of the first one, you can see. Forget about all the others. So that's the study of ecological rationality. And then you ask, so in how many situations do we have dominant Qs? Not in all, but in quite amazingly many situations we have found. That about half of the situations, but the machine learning data sets has a dominant Q. And the others don't have. And then you need to go tallying, or 1 over n. I was talking about the difference between risk and uncertainty. And decision making under risk requires logic and statistics, but under uncertainty requires more. And logical rationality is not the same as ecological rationality. Ecological rationality is about the success in the world. Logical rationality is about consistency. And under uncertainty, we have less is more. And it gives us a lesson that we can be much more efficient in the information we use than we do. And there was a remark about the methodology. We need to check the models by testing in the future, not just data fitting. And I think that's a vision about changing behavioral economics into what it once was, or supposed to be. Herbert Simon's idea is take uncertainty seriously. Take your
raw data really doesn't have a voice. It takes models, theories, and intuition to use data. And then I'm going to argue that models are metaphors that explain the world we don't understand in terms of things we already do. Models only tell you what something is more or less like. They don't tell you what it actually is. Theories try to tell you what something really is. And finally, it takes intuition to discover a theory. And at the end, I want to briefly argue that financial models are metaphors. They're idealizations that always sweep dirt under the rug. And good models and good modelers have an obligation to make the dirt explicit so that people who use the models will understand what their flaws are. So I want to talk about intuition, first of all, which is something that Professor Gigerenzer spoke about too. And I like to argue that it takes intuition to discover the nature of the world. And if you look at what Kepler, Newton, I'm invoking mostly physicists here, but I will get away from that. Kepler, Newton, Ampere, Maxwell, Einstein, Dirac, who predicted the existence of the positron. All of them get to the starting point of their theory by some feat of intuition. And intuition may sound casual, but it takes intimate knowledge of the world acquired by careful observation and painstaking effort. And everybody's very in love with reasoning and logic these days, but reasoning can only begin when intuition has put down an idea. And that's what Kepler does. Later on, that's what Ampere does when he discovers the law of force between currents. And if you look, there's a famous speech that Keynes gave about Newton when he discovered in 1942 a box of, somewhere in some Cambridge college, a box of papers of Newton's that had been there for hundreds of years. And he looked through them all and he actually intended to give the speech in 1942, but he had to wait till after the war, by which time he was dead, and his brother gave the speech, and you can find it anywhere on the internet. And one of his sentences is, about Newton, I fancy his preeminence is due to his muscles of intuition being the strongest and most enduring with which a man has ever been gifted. The second mode of understanding that people use beyond intuition is theories. And I like to distinguish between theories and models, which I'm going to do here. Theories are deep descriptions of theories are deep descriptions of the laws of the world. Theories can be right. They're attempts at deep descriptions. They can be right, they can be partially right, they can be totally wrong, but they have a certain epistemological or ontological quality. What all theories have in common is that, like if you know the Bible, like God's voice to Moses from the burning bush in the desert, they proclaim, I am what I am. Theories say, this is the way the world works. They stand on their own feet. They're not analogies, they're facts. And Newton's laws saying force equals mass times acceleration is a theory. The law of gravitation, inverse square law is a theory. They simply say, this is the way the world works. Newton's laws have been supplanted 300 years later by Einstein's, but that doesn't mean that Newton's an approximation to Einstein. Einstein is more accurate, but both Newton and Einstein are theories. As an analogy, Newton is to Einstein as cursive writing is to typing, or as navigation by the stars is to the global positioning system. Cursive and typing are both different ways of transmitting information, but cursive is not approximation to typing. They're two different approaches that reach the same end by different means with different accuracies, but one is not an approximation to the other. Both Newton's laws and Einstein, starting from a different point of view, are theories. One may be more accurate, but they're both theories that more or less describe the facts. I like a quote from Goethe from long ago that says, one day we will realize that every fact is really a theory, meaning a description of a fact is a theory. In contrast, another way of understanding things, and one uses both theories and models, which I'm going to talk about now in physics, are models. And models are, I want to give an example. There's a nice line by Arthur Schopenhauer where he says, I'm quoting here, sleep is the interest that we have to pay on the capital which is called in at death. And the higher the rate of interest and the more regularly it is paid, the further the date of redemption is postponed. This is bad for me, given that I'm up in the middle of the night right now. So he's making an analogy here. He's saying, if you buy a bond, you have to pay regular interest and eventually have to pay back the capital. If you sleep, you have to sleep every night. And because of the similarity between the periodicity of sleep and the periodicity of bond coupon payments, he then says, since you must have borrowed money and paid it back, you must have borrowed life from the darkness. You pay it back every night and you pay back the principal at the end. This is kind of a clever metaphor. And metaphors are an insight that something is a lot like something else, although it's not identical to it. And to me, a model is a metaphor. It compares something we don't understand, in this case, like sleep, to something we already do, which is bond repayments, coupons. Models are sort of metaphors. As I said, they kind of graven images of reality, but not reality itself. And one of the dangers with finance is that because models are analogies, their incautious use by taking them too seriously when they're wrong, can unleash all the dangers of idolatry that God warned against in the second commandment. If you take a model, which is really a man-made thing, think of Pygmalion, and assume that it's actually God's truth. The last mode of understanding is very popular these days is data and statistics, the statistical analysis that lies behind big data, machine learning. Statistics seeks to find past tendencies and correlations in data. Often people assume they will persist, but statistics only looks at the past, as everyone knows, and correlation doesn't imply causation, as somebody once famously said. So big data is useful, but at least to me, useful as it is, it's not a replacement for the classical ways of understanding the world. Data doesn't have a voice. There isn't anything like raw data. A human being has to decide what data they're going to look at, just like Kepler did. Choosing what data to collect takes insight. Making good sense of it still requires the classic methods, meaning a model, which is an analogy, a theory, which is an attempt at description, and is deeper, or intuition to begin with to find a cause. In finance, I think shallow is better, and I suppose this is related to Professor Gigerenzer's comments about heuristics. I think in finance, shallow is actually better, and it's better to not, although it's tempting and one does drop down deep sometimes, most of the time it's better to use more vulgar market variables and think about them in a sophisticated way. So if you build models, if you build more detailed models that drop down deep, you're always sweeping dirt under the rug, and that's okay, but you have to be honest and tell people about it. And I like to think of models as none of them being true, all of them being Duncan experiments, imaginary experiments, simulations in imaginary worlds that don't exactly resemble our world, which is much more complicated. So I'm wrapping up. Because of what I said, I think the solution to our financial crisis will not lie in better mathematical models. Nevertheless, modeling is useful. William Blake wrote, if a fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise, which in this concept means it's good to take models seriously up to a point, and maybe even be foolish to the point of using black holes and calculating all sorts of sophisticated things. But then, so a little hubris in taking models seriously is very good, and being a fool that persists in his folly. But at some point, you have to realize that you may have gone too far, and catastrophes strike when the hubris evolves into idolatry. Somewhere between these two extremes, sort of north of common sense, but remaining south of idolatry, is the region for the wise use of models.
So one answer to your question of what's going wrong is the illusion of complexity. So the idea that complex problems need complex solutions. They need complex solutions if you are in a stable world. That's where big data works, where tomorrow is like yesterday. Big data does not work, even for predicting customer predictions. Yeah? So, and we in finance, and including financial regulation, everything gets always more complex. If something doesn't work, you make it complex. So Basel I had about 30 pages. Basel II had 347 pages. Basel III had over 600 pages. So that's, and Basel IV, God knows if it comes, will have even more because of that type of illusion. If you calculate the value at risk, as we just heard, and if you're a large bank, you have thousands of risk factors that correlate. You have to estimate the covariances in the order of millions. Good luck. This borders on astrology. That's not science.
We've been hearing a lot about whether markets are minds. So Vivienne gave us 3 possibilities yesterday in her talk. And I'm going to explore something a little bit different that says that not that markets are minds, but that they extend human minds. So this idea of markets as social systems that we kind of form a single system with, so that it's a kind of amalgam of biological cultural system, and that this amalgam of our human biology and this cultural social system of the market come together to form a single system. And that system, I want to try to argue, actually changes our consciousness, transforms our consciousness in a particular way that we see with market moods. So that's the sort of perspective that I want to present you with today. When we're thinking about market moods, we can think of them as emergent processes that might enslave the behavior of individual investors. So if you're an individual investor right now, then there's a good chance that you're going to be taken up by the kind of anxiety that there is in the market right now about future possibilities of crises that we were very much hearing about yesterday in lots of detail, actually. So that mood of anxiety you can think of as like a collective variable, an order parameter that we should think of as an emergent process, so something that's operating at the macro scale, but is enslaving the behavior of individual investors, leading to a market where there's a kind of sell mentality. So I wanted to actually take very seriously, and this is something that that Andrew Hauser was saying yesterday, we should maybe just think of as a narrative that journalists make use of ascribing a kind of personality to the market and thinking of these kinds of moods as something that helps us to write stories about what's happening in the market, maybe to make sense of things. But and Nick Chater was like going even further and saying, look, this is just an as-if model. We shouldn't think of markets literally as having these sorts of moods or emotions. I want to try to push the idea, no, there's a sense in which this makes literal sense. And so we shouldn't just think of it as metaphorical license when we talk about the market in these terms. We should try to see it as something that we can make literal sense of. And I want to suggest that we can think of the price discovery system as this like social cultural system that actually extends consciousness. So you've got a biological system, a brain in a body, that is coupling with this price discovery system when we engage in investment in a market. And so it's this coupling of this biological system with this cultural system to form a kind of biocultural system that is extending consciousness. So we can think of moods, market moods, as an example of extended consciousness. So the idea of extended consciousness, like the idea of the extended mind, is that the boundary between what's inside of the mind and what's outside is blurry and actually hard to define because of the close kinds of couplings that human beings have with their environments. So Geoff yesterday gave the example of mobile phones. That's a very clear example, I think, of how the coupling between human beings and their technological environments is such that it makes this distinguishing what's inside of the mind, what's outside, hard to draw in a hard and fast way. Instead, the boundary between humans and their environments are very malleable, and we incorporate all kinds of technologies into our thinking. Mobile phones are an excellent example of this. Look, what markets are really good at is aggregating diverse competing opinions of different investors. So what you get is a kind of wisdom of the crowds effect. So Francis Galton was writing about how in a market, we did an experiment actually where he asked people in a market to estimate the weight of a cow, and then he compared the most accurate estimate with the averaging of the estimates across all of the participants. And what he found was that the averaging of the estimates was actually more accurate than the most accurate guess. So there's something about markets, something about crowds that under certain conditions, not always, allows for a kind of wisdom. And what you see in market moods is a kind of convergence. Chris Frith and colleagues describe this as a reciprocal alignment, this sort of convergence, where you see that kind of reciprocal alignment in many different behaviors. And you also see it in markets. So when there's this kind of convergence on a particular response, let's say, sell, buy, rather than this competition of different opinions, what emerges is out of that dynamic is this mood.
What I'm going to suggest, I think the theme of this conference is to decide whether the market really does have a mind or does not. And my bias has been to think that not only has the market a mind, but more broadly, and what I'm going to argue, is that the economy as a whole has a mind, or behaves as a mind, that it is an entity, and that the economy as a whole needs to be treated by economists and by economic theory as an entity, and not just as a collection of atomistic individuals. Atoms are just abstractions, the people are reality, and in economics, the market is an abstraction and the people are reality. I think that's actually a big mistake, because the atoms, the people play the same role in the market as the atoms do in the understanding of human behavior. And we can't understand human behavior by trying to analyze the movements of the atoms and even the chemical compounds inside our mind. Equally, we can't understand the movements of the market or of the macroeconomy by trying to drill down to the atomistic individuals. The second point I wanted to make is that economies don't just have moods, they also have emotions and desires. And here I will go a bit beyond what I think some of the previous speakers were saying. And they have emotions and desires, and specifically, they have ideological political motivations. What Adam Smith discovered, and has been true ever since, is that most decisions in a complex society have to be made, or should be made, through economic decision-making of £1, one vote. That's the best way of organizing, and really the only functional way of organizing a very, very complex economy. That's true of most decisions, but crucially, it is not true of all decisions. And again, John Kay reminded us yesterday of this comment that Warren Buffett made about efficient markets versus inefficient markets. And Buffett said, markets are efficient 90% of the time, but they're not efficient 10% of the time. And that difference between 90% and 100% is the difference between night and day. I think the same is true about economic decision-making as opposed to political decision-making. In organizing a complex economy, 90% of the time, you want the market to make those decisions. But crucially, you don't want that to happen 100% of the time. At various points, maybe roughly once in a generation, the ideology that has emerged from the previous generation about, if you like, what is an appropriate or a desirable balance between the interests of different individuals and different groups changes dramatically as a result of 30, 40, 50 years of successful operation in which those groups come into balance, and then the balance starts shifting again. So I think it's about the political interests of identifiable, powerful groups.
Yeah, so that would be part of what Patrick calls the economy, I think, rather than the market. Yes. And the distinction that he makes. So, yeah. So,
although I think in the market, you do have similar type of things. Much more crudely in the market, you have, as you said, the bulls and the bears, and the and bulls and bears. Incidentally, I spend more of my time involved in financial markets now than I do with macroeconomics, and bulls and bears are. There are two motives. One is obviously they're both trying to make money, so to a significant extent, they're people who've made money either by being on the long side or the short side. But they're also, in my experience, are quite clear psychological and sort of embedded psychological distinctions between people who are naturally bearish and people who are naturally bullish, and people who therefore think that they can make money in a bull market rather than bear market, and the balance of those also shifts. And actually I hadn't thought of this, but it shifts as a result of long-term trends. Just as I was saying, I mean, the quote I had from Kaletsky basically said, look, the working class was kind of completely, on its back in the 1930s, was completely oppressed by unemployment. Now we're getting rid of unemployment. There's going to be full employment forever. This is going to work fine for 20, 25, 30 years. But eventually, when the working class is no longer oppressed by fears of unemployment, it's going to become so powerful and so dominant that the capitalist class is going to have to react against them to reintroduce the fear of the sack by deliberately creating recessions, very deep recessions, which generate unemployment. So in a way, the same is true, in markets. You've had a bull market for 14, 13 years. The bulls become overconfident. The bears are completely in despair, but the overconfidence of the bulls eventually leads to a reaction.
So here's a difference that I want to point to, which goes back to a question we've been talking about repeatedly of whether the market has a mind or not. So you started off by saying that markets or economies, you were focusing on, let's say, have desires, emotions, moods. And the picture that I was presenting was one where we can think of markets as cultural, social systems that extend our biologically based minds. So the result of that is the formation of a biocultural system. So I would be hesitant about saying that the market itself is a mind that has desires and emotions and so on, and instead reframe that as the idea that that markets as social systems can socially extend our mind. So markets are what Sean Gallagher calls cognitive institutions. And these cognitive institutions, when we take part in them, say the price discovery system, can transform the kind of cognition that we are capable of, or transform the kind of conscious experiences we have in the case of market moods. So the notion of extension here is that something is made possible by our taking part in these systems that wouldn't otherwise be possible for us. So there are new forms of cognition, new ways of thinking, new kinds of experiences like market moods that emerge out of our forming symbiotic systems with these kinds of institutions.
Not only did mainstream economics not predict the financial crisis, but it had great difficulty in finding an explanation for it, and indeed the explanation involved only marginal differences to the existing framework. But on top of that, there was moral outrage against economics because it was perceived that economic ideas had been instrumental in causing the crisis by encouraging the way in which the financial sector behaved. Now, mainstream economics is presented as an exercise in technical expertise, in other words, something that is quite detached from any moral issues. But it's become harder and harder to sustain this, and there's been a tremendous growth of pressure from young scholars challenging the mainstream and wanting to explore different approaches to economics in order to form their own view about which they prefer. And this is a movement which is much more strong than previous student movements because of the scale. It has a global scale, and because of its institutional structure, which ensures its longevity. The two main groupings are the Young Scholars Initiative, promoted by the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and the Rethinking Economics movement, which is organised by students themselves primarily. There's always financial innovation, for example, in response to new developments, to take up new profit opportunities. The state responds with new regulation and so on. But also behaviour responds particularly to the presence of uncertainty. If we have no scope for demonstrative truth, most knowledge is held with uncertainty, and we have to deal with that in everyday life and in financial markets. And Minsky analysed how individuals, or more importantly groups of individuals, adopt particular behaviours and particular sets of expectations. But he also emphasised the interaction with the real economy. There was no sense that the financial sector was separate from the real economy, because finance, for all it's taken on a life of its own lately, it's still the source of the fuel to facilitate investment, real investment. And so we have this interaction in the form of increased debt. We have the interaction in terms of the valuation of debt under uncertainty. And we have shifting patterns whereby for a long time reality might not impinge on judgment very much, and then the system is brought up short by being confronted with some stark reality.
I think taking the market mind seriously means treating it as a socio-technical cognitive system. That is, one that's tracking relevant facts in the world. I think it's also one that's in part generating certain kinds of facts too. Facts about value, levels of risk, and so on. I don't mean anything particularly postmodern when I talk about generating facts here. You could go that route, I suppose. I mean it in a much more flat-footed way, just as, for example, a sporting body can change the rules, and that will generate facts of a certain kind about, I think about VAR in a football game, and how that, generates, in a sense, facts about whether a shot counts as a goal and so forth. I think similar things go on when we have institutional structures that make decisions about, in this case, value, risk, and so on. In a sense, they're generating facts, but I don't mean that we don't need to construe that in a postmodern way, particularly. I'm primarily interested, though, in the tracking phenomenon here. So, cognitive system tracking facts of this particular kind in this particular domain. That implies expertise that's involved in the socio-technical cognitive system, which in turn implies a kind of socio-technical knowledge. And my interest in is, how is this to be understood? The idea of exploring socio-technical cognitive systems this way isn't novel to me, but there isn't, surprisingly, isn't it, that much work done on this in terms of exploring the financial markets. So I think it's ripe for further exploration. Let me say a little bit about what extended cognition is. This goes back to Clark and Chalmers' famous work. Andy Clark has done a lot of work following up from this, and there's a whole research program now exploring extended cognition. But this occurs when features of the subject's cognitive environment, such as technology, but this can also be social, as we'll see, become seamlessly integrated into the onboard cognitive processes. And the thought is that in the right conditions, this becomes more than just technological assistance, right? It's a genuine kind of cognitive augmentation. So the thought is, not every time we use an instrument is our relationship to the instrument our cognitive relation one of subject to instrument. I mean, obviously sometimes it is. But the thought is, in the right kind of circumstances, if the instrument is appropriately integrated into our cognitive systems, then the instrument can become a proper part of one's cognitive processes. So one's cognitive processes, as it were, become extended. They now take in not just what's going on underneath the skin and skull of the subject, but also take in features of the environment. They become part of the cognitive processes as well. This is quite familiar in the technological case. We can think about how, often when you have expertise involving technology, there becomes a certain point where the use of the technology becomes so fluent that we start to think about the cognitive process differently. That is, we start to think about the technology as being a part of an integrated part of the subject cognitive process rather than simply an external aid. But we can also think of social factors functioning that way. And indeed, we can also, in a more complex case, think of technological and social factors working together to become part of extended cognitive processes. Okay, so here's what I've argued. I've tried to give you a sense of three ways of thinking about the socio-technical cognitive system that we have in play here and the kinds of cognition that it might be involved in, the kind of knowledge that they might generate. And I've done that through the lens of extended cognition. So we have the weakest notion, which is kind of socio-technologically facilitated cognition. So we're thinking of the cognitive system as just facilitating cognition, facilitating knowledge. Stronger notion, which is extended cognition proper of a socio-technical kind, which is leading to knowledge. But as I've suggested, that primarily leads to individual knowledge. Doesn't yet imply a group agent. There are reasons why we would expect, even where there's cases of socio-technical extended knowledge, it not to generate a more stronger notion, which is that of socio-technically distributed cognition. This is where there's commitment to an irreducible group agent and therefore an irreducible group knower. So that's what I've been trying to argue. Notice, by the way, as I said at the beginning, everything here is at the level of cognition. It's at the level of the epistemological ramifications of that cognition. Nothing immediately follows from what I've just said about there being, a market mind in the strongest sense. It could be, for example, that there is a market mind in the strongest sense, but that attributions of knowledge flow to the individual typically. I mean, that would be one conclusion where you'd have a stronger conception of the market mind and a weaker conception of the cognitive processes in play and the knowledge that results. They're actually, on the face of it, compatible ideas. And what that means is that it's very much a further question how one sees these debates panning out in terms of the market mind as a socio-technical cognitive system and the market mind understood more generally.
I mean, the emotional finance literature is somewhat individualistic. It refers to individual agency and it portrays actors as making individual choices and persuading others to make individual choices. And yet for many actors within the financial sector, it's more helpful to think sociologically about how these structures work and what motivates behavior, but also what provides the basis for knowledge. And this is where sentiment comes in. And again, we can refer back to Adam Smith and his notion of the individual as something that is inherently social. And so our behavior it refers to others and refers to others' opinions of us, or even internally to the impartial spectator. Within behavioral finance, the impartial spectator is often understood as somebody who draws people back to rationality in a sort of narrow sense. Whereas for Smith, it was essentially it was the role of conscience.
Can I just remark on the monetary policy examples? I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I think there you've got group decision making, right? So you've definitely got a social system and socio-technical as well, right? They're relying on technology that's integrated. It has all the right features of feedback loops and so on. It's been established and run over time. So enough, I think, to think of it as like a group cognition going on of some kind. But it's also interesting that in those cases, I mean, these are minuted meetings. People have to take positions. Those positions are recorded. It's the patterns of responsibility in terms of those cognitive processes and how they relate to the individuals involved is very clearly mapped. So it actually, I think that would be a case that would fit the kind of, the format that I had, where sure, there's a sense in which the group deliberates and comes to know something, but it doesn't seem to be irreducible group knowledge. In fact, it seems to be a socio-technical system. There's extended cognition, kind of group cognition, but group cognition, which nonetheless leads to individual knowing. It's reducible to individual knowing. So I think cases like that, they sort of confirm that threshold. that when we look at these cases, you can have genuine socio-technical extended cognition without thereby having an irreducible knower.
I remind people that economics is called the dismal science. And I'm not sure it's a science at all, but if it is, it's certainly dismal in the sense that it is not, it's not like physics, where if you do A, you always get B. Sometimes you get C, or sometimes nothing at all. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, once said, physics would be much harder if electrons had feelings. You walk in a room, you throw the light switch, the light goes on. It always goes on because every time when you throw the light switch, the electrons flow from the switch to the light. They never forget to flow. They never decide to flow in a different direction. They never flow from the light to the switch. They never go on strike complain that they're undercompensated. So the point is that economics is not a science, in my opinion, in the sense that if A happens, science is all about causality and predictability. And if A happens, then B is sure to happen. Well, that's certainly not true in economics. If A happens, B might tend to happen most of the time. That doesn't make it a science. So now let's talk about using these concepts to refer to investing, not economics. I have a presentation that I give called The Human Side of Investing, or The Difference Between Theory and Practice. And it was inspired by a quote from a great philosopher, you may know him or maybe not, since you're not American, Yogi Berra. And Yogi Berra was a great catcher for the New York Yankees in the 1950s, highly skilled baseball player, but famous today for the things he says, or maybe he didn't say them. One of the things Yogi says is, I didn't say, I never said half the things I said. But anyway, he once said, supposedly, that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And to me, that is the essence of this answer to you. It's the essence of my work. It should be, in my opinion, the essence of your work and the essence of your colleagues in this conference. What we learn in school, in my opinion, and what we should learn in school, is how things are supposed to work. That goes for the economy, and that goes for the market. But they might also help you by telling you, but you know what? They don't always work that way. That's a framework. That's a thought model, but it certainly does not govern all the time. And that's the key. The hypothesis says, because of the concerted actions of so many investors, security prices are right. And they price securities so that you can expect a fair risk-adjusted return, no more, no less. Again, that's how it's supposed to work. Certainly not how it does work. I think I said in the conclusion of that memo that if you ignore the efficient market hypothesis, you're going to be very disappointed, because you're going to find out that very few of your active decisions work. But if you swallow it whole, you won't be an investor, and you'll give up on active success. So the truth, if there is one, has to lie somewhere in between. And that's what I believe. Economic man is supposed to make all these decisions in a way that optimizes wealth. But she doesn't, because she's not often objective and rational. She has moods. And those moods interfere with this arriving at the right price. So what my definition of the efficient market hypothesis is that because of the concerted efforts of all the participants, the price at a given point in time is as close to right as those people can get it. And because it is as close to right as most of them can get it, it's very hard to outperform the market by finding errors, what we call inefficiencies. I think of just mistakes. Sometimes prices are too high. Sometimes prices are too low. But because the price reflects the collective wisdom of all investors on that subject, very few of the individuals can find those mistakes and profit from them. And that's why active investing doesn't work. And I think that the markets, the economies, but more importantly, the markets are subject to mass hysteria. And I think it was on the couch that I said, in the real world, things fluctuate between pretty good and not so hot. But in the markets, they go from flawless to hopeless. And if just think about that one sentence, is it true? I believe it's true. And if it's true, then that shows you the error, because nothing is flawless and nothing is hopeless. But markets, I believe, treat things as flawless and hopeless. And there's the error. My book that I mentioned, Mastering the Market Cycle, I'm going to keep repeating the title in the hope that everybody will buy it. I am a devotee of cycles. I'm a student of cycles. I've lived through half a dozen important cycles in my career. I've thought about them. I think they dominate what I do. And I got about 2/3 of the way through writing that book, and something dawned on me, a question. Why do we have cycles? The S&P, I mentioned Jim Laurie, the Center for Research in Security Prices, told us that about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, more, that from 28 to 62, the S&P had risen 9.2% a year, returned 9.2. Recent work, things have been better since. So I think that if you go back and look at the whole last 90 years, it's 10.5% a year for 90 years, the return on the S&P 500. Here's a question. Why doesn't it just go up 10.5% every year? And why sometimes up 20 and sometimes down 20 and so forth? In fact, and I've included this factoid in one of my memos, it's almost never between 8 and 12. Mm-hmm. So if the average is 10.5, why isn't it clustered around 10.5? Why is it clustered outside of the central range? And I think
distorting also the normal distribution.
Exactly. And I think the answer is mass hysteria. When you watch TV and you hear the newsreaders talking about what happened in the stock market today, you get the impression that prices are the result of fundamentals, and changes in prices are the result of changes in fundamentals. And that is vastly inadequate. By the way, they always say the market went up today because of X, or the market went down today because of Y. I always say, where do they go to find that out? Because I haven't found it yet. I haven't found where you go to have an explanation of change of the market's behavior, even after the fact. But it's not true that it's all about fundamentals. The price of an asset is based on fundamentals and how people view those fundamentals. And a change in an asset price is based on the change in fundamentals and the change in how people view those fundamentals. So facts and attitudes. So any research that could capture, changes in attitudes, I think is important. It's very important when you're an investor to be a skeptic and to not believe what you hear. And most people think that being a skeptic consists of saying, that's too good to be true. But when pessimism is excessive, being a skeptic means saying that's too bad to be true. And that particular investor couldn't imagine any scenario which couldn't be exceeded on the downside. So in other words, for that person, there was no limit to negativism. And when I can go out in the market and conclude that the other people in the market, that is the people setting the market prices, are excessively negative and excessively risk averse, then I, an inherently conservative person, my partner Bruce Karsh, who runs our distressed debt funds, an inherently conservative person, we go crazy spending money when we conclude that there's excessive pessimism, fear, risk aversion embodied in asset prices. And so it's not just the mechanical aspects that determine market prices. It's psychology. It's mass hysteria, which comes in waves from time to time that lead to these market cycles which prove excessive.
Now, here's some experiences that I've had. I absolutely know for a fact. Here are the things that I experience every day. And again, these are things which they just cannot be accommodated within the current framework. A question I asked earlier is related to the first one. What is the information content of a price? You know, when the I forgot his name now, I think it was Pritchard, he said, well, you know, information is not knowledge because we don't know how to reconstruct it. Information absolutely is knowledge. I'm telling you, right, it contains knowledge. Now, we might not be able to deconstruct it, but anyone in the market will know that the market price contains information. It contains an expectation. Howard Marks said, if there was one thing that I would want to know about security performance, how much optimism is in the price. This is a variable, this is a piece of information, and it's somehow, very mysteriously, it's embodied in the price, right? What is the information content of price? Again, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing in this kind of mechanistic view. Alpha decay. Alpha decay is the process by which, you know, I think it was I can't remember the two guys now. I think it was Sick Boy and Trainspotting, famous 90s film Trainspotting, kind of grand theory of everything. One day you've got it, then you haven't, right? And that kind of explained everything. That's alpha decay. You get these hot streaks that can last for years. Investors will do very, very well, and then it all just disappears. It just evaporates. And what seems to happen, well, we'll come on to that in a moment. I can see what happens, right? But again, this is not something that you can really answer in this mechanistic system. And then the reason we're all here today, what is the market mood? Again, there's been a lot of kind of discussion and kind of conversation about, you know, whether or not there is a market mood. Again, all I can say is there just absolutely 100% is a market mood. We were talking about over dinner last night. I wouldn't overplay the kind of bipolar thing, because that kind of implies that the market's just not rational. And generally it is. You'd be amazed at just how rational the market usually is, right? It just has these kind of fits sometimes, right? But there is absolutely a market mood. And it's kind of like if you're sitting at a table with your kind of family and someone's just had a really bad day and everyone at the table, around the table, knows about it and everyone can feel it, and and they're not saying anything, but we all know, right? And there's that mood, right? That's what the market can do to the environment. That's what the market does too. So the market absolutely has this a mood which is kind of tangible. But again, how do you think about that? Right, that's the hardest one of all. Right, this is exactly Patrick's kind of hard problem of finance. I talked about alpha decay, and what it was is the kind of situation where you'll get a very successful investment strategy. You'll have an investor who performs very, very well for a period of time, and then it just disappears. And then some new strategy suddenly makes a lot of sense, right? And that works for a while, and then it actually kind of doesn't work. Now, the reason I know a little bit about this is because in my day job at Calderwood, what we do, the hedge fund I run, is actually about trying to produce very, very stable, predictable, unvolatile returns, regardless of the market environment, right? And that's actually very, very hard. Why? Because pretty much every single asset, and certainly every single strategy, is a function of the environment. It's always a function of the environment. Nature is wild. Right, financial markets are wild. They do not obey a very well-behaved symmetric normal distribution. They're very, very fat tails. They do absolutely crazy things. And as I said, it's not just in the distribution of wealth, it's in the current change in prices. Again, you see these kind of distributional parallels between an economy and between a brain. These two charts here show the correlations between neural activity in two different, between roughly 150 brain regions. The one on the left shows basically no correlation. There's no correlation, very little correlation between these neuronal regions. And that's the state where the subject is not having a seizure. This is when they're just normally kind of conscious. The one on the right shows what happens when the subject has a seizure. And suddenly, all the neuronal waves correlate and start to move in sync. They all move at exactly the same rhythm. And this is very damaging, it seems, for the brain. Now, I think anyone in finance will look at that and absolutely instantly recognize what they see. They'll instantly recognize that as a cross-asset correlation matrix, right? That's what they'll see. When the markets dump, when the markets really get hammered, what happens is everything correlates. Everything moves in exactly the same direction. So this kind of market malfunction seems to have, again, maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe it's just a metaphor, but I just wonder if there's a kind of deeper underlying structure in common. And if there is, this structure will be mathematical, right? This is the use of mathematics and science. So again, there's nothing wrong with mathematics. Just don't use them, don't abuse mathematics, use mathematics. So the final conclusion, I'm going to leave you with a quote from John Wheeler. John Wheeler, famous quantum physicist, who actually supervised Richard Feynman's PhD, again, central to the Manhattan Project. Towards the end of his life, he got very, very interested in quantum information theory. And we've already kind of heard this kind of notion of where the mind kind of begins and ends. It's not necessarily all in the skull. Given his kind of quantum expertise and the importance of observation to determine outcome, Wheeler wondered if we actually had things the wrong way around. And Wheeler actually wondered if the universe was actually a mind, right? And this is what he said, are life and mind irrelevant to the structure of the universe, or are they central to the universe? Carl Sagan has very famously wondered if the mind and consciousness is the way the universe understands itself, right? So if physicists are allowed to ask themselves if what they're actually looking at is a big organism and a big mind, then I think that we are allowed to do the same. When you know that you're getting a bargain, you know that you're getting a good deal because you want to puke, right? When you're buying, you want to throw up, right? You're terrified, but you do it anyway, right? And the reason that works is because you can guarantee that if you're really terrified, the rest of the market will be terrified as well. Why would the market be terrified? Because the prices are just completely collapsing.
The market is more rational, the more heterogeneous the thought is. And the more homogeneous it is, the dumber it is, because error and emotion and psychology take over from ration.